Waiver wire winners for fantasy football heading into Week 10. Kyler Murray is nearing his return to action. He's been a top 12 quarterback in fantasy points per game in all 4 seasons. He's had 2 seasons of 22-plus fantasy points per game. In Week 9, the Ravens operated as a running back committee, but Keaton Mitchell, the rookie, exploded for 138 rushing yards and a touchdown on just 9 rushing attempts, showing that 4.37 speed. I like the idea of an explosive running back in a committee on one of the league's best offenses. 16.8, 22.46, 20.62 fantasy points for Taysom Hill the last 3 games. He is the most unique player in all of fantasy football. 4 receptions for 50 yards and a rushing touchdown in Week 7, 63 yards and 2 rushing touchdowns in Week 8, 4 receptions and a receiving touchdown, along with 52 rushing yards in Week 9. He even tossed a touchdown to the other tight end, Juwan Johnson, this past week. He's a near cheat code for fantasy football as a tight end. It was a quiet Week 9 for rookie Quentin Johnston, but Justin Herbert really didn't have to sling it against the Jets. Back in Week 8, Johnston finished with 4 receptions for 50 yards. We have Joshua Palmer on the IR with Mike Williams. He's the wide receiver 2, which should have some upside as he develops with Justin Herbert. Zach Charbonnet has been leading the Seahawks backfield in snaps. He's played 59% and 55% the last 2 games. So maybe the touches aren't there right now, but he should be at least rostered. 3 straight weeks as a top 12 fantasy quarterback for Baker Mayfield, the 4th time this season he's finished as that. Back-to-back games with a pair of passing touchdowns. He's had 42 passing attempts in 2 out of 3 of his last games. And we like his duo of Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. Luke Musgrave in Week 9 caught 3 balls for 51 yards and scored his first touchdown, 14.1 fantasy points. It was his 2nd game of 50-plus receiving yards. He played 83% of the snaps. It's his 3rd time playing that or higher this season. He's had weeks of 8 and 7 targets, and now we have Christian Watson banged up. It was the 2nd game across the last 3 weeks that Odell Beckham Jr. earned 7 targets. He caught 5 of them in Week 9 for 56 yards and a touchdown for 14.6 fantasy points as the Baltimore wide receiver 2. 5 receptions for 100 yards and a touchdown, 21 fantasy points for Jonnu Smith. He's had games of 95 and 67 receiving yards prior to Week 9. That was his 3rd week over 13 fantasy points, which is good for tight ends. Tyjae Spears played 59% of the snaps in Week 9, season-high 6 targets. 6 weeks playing 52+% of the snaps keeps him involved. 4 receptions in 3 games, 3+ receptions in 5 games. Worst case scenario, he is a handcuff for Derrick Henry. Khalil Shakir has played 65% and 71% of the snaps the last 2 games. He caught all 6 targets in Week 8 for 92 yards. He caught all 4 targets for 57 yards in Week 9. He actually out-targeted Gabe Davis this past week. Antonio Gibson has had 5 catches in each of his last 2 games. He played 51% of the snaps in Week 8, and he finished with 42 receiving yards in Week 9. He also rushed 6 times for 34 yards this past week. I simply think Elijah Mitchell, if given the full workload in San Francisco, would be one of the best handcuffs. So knock on wood that nothing ever happens to Christian McCaffrey, but this guy, his rookie season in 11 games, rushed for 963 yards. I love target volume and consistency with that for tight ends, and Cade Otton the last 3 weeks has earned 6, 6, and 9 targets. He caught 6 of those 9 targets for 70 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns, 23 points in Week 9. Another quarterback to mention is Joshua Dobbs. In his first game in Minnesota, he had 2 passing and 1 rushing touchdown, along with 66 rushing yards. Dobbs has been a top 8 fantasy quarterback 4 times this season. And while we might have liked Marquise Brown and Trey McBride back with the Cardinals where he came from, I think it's just a different system when you have Jordan Addison, TJ Hawkinson, and eventually Justin Jefferson. We don't know what's going to happen with the quarterback situation for the Giants now that Daniel Jones' season is over. Tyrod Taylor is also banged up, but I like Wan'Dale Robinson the best in that wide receiver room. 4 catches for 35 yards and a touchdown for 13.5 fantasy points in Week 9. He scored 14.2 fantasy points in Week 6, catching all 8 targets for 62 yards. So here's to fingers crossed that they sign maybe a veteran and he can have some relevance as a trustworthy slot. Follow us at Fantrax for consistent fantasy football content.